Part 3, we have gone through life in Russia in the present day. We've gone through pages 492 through 506, and we've written a lot about Russia right now, but now we're going to go into the history of Russia. Some of this you may already know from previous lessons. Life in the past in Russia. So we're skipping back in the textbook to page 494, and we're going to talk about the early history. The very first Slav state, Slav is an ethnicity of people who live in Russia, was called the Kievan Rus. And it was led by a lot of famous princes. And the Grand Prince of Kiev, the most important guy, his name was Ivan the Fourth, and he was known as Ivan the Terrible. So the way that we're going to write that down is that we're starting on 494. And early history. Kievan Rus. Was the first Slav state. Led by famous princes. I feel like Ivan the Terrible had to have a bad name for a reason, so we'll put a frowny face next to him. All right, on page 495, you and I talk about kings and queens all of the time, but a monarch in Russia was called a czar. Pretend that C is not there. A czar. Czar is Russian for Caesar, which means powerful ruler. So on 495, we're going to write down that the word czar is the Russian way to say powerful ruler. You and I might just call it a king or a queen. So I'm going to draw a crown so we can remember this. They had royal families. The Romanov family were all royals. There was a very famous czar. They called him Peter the Great. And then there was a very famous empress, she was a czarina, which is a female powerful ruler. She was known as Empress Catherine the Great. And it turns out that all of these are just the most well-known Russian leaders. So we'd say these are they're the most well-known leaders. Okay, so a czar is a powerful ruler from Russia. The Romanov family was the royal family through many generations, and Peter the Great and Catherine the Great were very famous Russian rulers. Skipping to page 496, we're going to focus on the Russian Revolution. I think we've talked about this already, but basically there was a czar whose name was Nicholas. He was the part of the Romanov family, and he was forced to step down because the Bolsheviks had seized control of the government, and they executed the czar's family, and they created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. So on page 496, we're going to write down that in 1917 and 18, there was a group of revolutionaries And they called themselves the Bolsheviks. They took control. They took control of the government, and they tried to rid themselves of the monarchy by executing the Tsar and his family. So they took control of the government. Executed the Tsar. And then they created the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was different from a monarchy because it was communist. That means the government owns everything. And then fast forward a few decades where the Soviet Union Russia was called the Soviet Union because they were communist. And we fast forward, and then suddenly, right here on page 499, it says that Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, decided that he was going to perestroika, which means restructure the economy. And ultimately, here's his face, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russian leader. Ultimately, the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation began. And today, there is a leader called Vladimir Putin. So on page 499, we fast forward in history just a little bit, and we get to 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed. Which means, of course, no more communism. And the Russian Federation began. And today, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Oh dear, I messed up. And it looks like we have used every square inch of this paper. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, which means communism was no more. The Russian Federation began, so they decided to be called Russia again. And now, if we travel to Russia, Vladimir Putin would be the president.